Hello, everybody. Good to see you all tonight. Tomorrow is the book launch, and we're really excited. It's actually, the day has come. This has been 3 years of really intense work for me, and it is a lot like having a baby, except it's a very long labor. Or maybe a very long pregnancy and also a long labor. So it's really exciting. The book is beautiful, and it's a big moment to give birth to this book. So tonight we're going to talk about the mandala and how the mandala can change your mind, literally. How the mandala's effect on the mind can change your life. So before we begin, I always like to begin with raising bodhicitta, which is the intention to be together tonight, to share this time together for the benefit of all beings. And so whatever we do, if we generate bodhicitta before we do it, it changes it from potentially a selfish act or a meaningless act into an act that has meaning and benefit. So if we can, even just washing the dishes or going to work, if you generate a heartfelt desire that going to work will benefit all beings, or that washing the dishes or changing a diaper or anything that we do in our lives, that if we generate that thought, and citta is like a thought, it's kind of like a heart thought. I like that heart thought. It's a heart thought to benefit all beings. So let's take a moment and sit together quietly and raise bodhicitta, that intention to be together for the benefit of all beings. Thank you. I love the feeling of our etheric connection. I really feel it. And it's a beautiful community that we have developed here. So tonight I'll be talking about one of the central themes of my book, which is the mandala principle. And I thought I'd track a little bit my own personal history with it and what it's meant to me. So I grew up in New Hampshire, and there were no mandalas in New Hampshire. At least I didn't know there were any, if there were. Of course, mandalas are everywhere. Once you begin to understand what a mandala is, you see it everywhere. But I had never learned about it, certainly not from the Tibetan Buddhist point of view. Even the word Tibet was pretty much unknown when I was growing up in New Hampshire. I did find out about Tibet, and I looked it up in the encyclopedia, we had in the back hall, like all these encyclopedias, and I found it, and I read everything I could about it, but it didn't talk about mandalas. So it wasn't until I was 16 and I was visiting my grandparents. My grandfather was a professor at Harvard, and my grandmother was a PhD graduate of Harvard Radcliffe, and actually the fifth woman to get a PhD from Harvard or Harvard Radcliffe. I think they've eliminated the Radcliffe now. It was the women's college, and they've just made it all Harvard. But anyway, she was a really amazing person. My grandmother, her name was Frances Rumanier, and she pursued a PhD in philosophy. And went to Germany and studied and came back and never expected to marry. You know, in those days you didn't do both. And so she had decided to be a scholar, and she loved what she was doing. And she met my grandmother when she was considered to be pretty old to get married, which I think was about 35. And she married and had 3 daughters. And she gave me my first book on Buddhism. And so they lived in Cambridge, near Harvard Square, and I was going to school outside of Cambridge in the suburbs of Boston, and I would go visit them on weekends. I was going to a boarding school, and so I had a good excuse if I could go visit my grandparents. And I loved to go to Harvard Square, and so I would wander around and just all the interesting people from all over the world. And so I came upon this book, and I actually have a copy, and so I'm going to show it to you. Can you see it? It's called Man and His Symbols, and it has a mandala on the cover. And that was the first time I ever saw a mandala. And it captivated me in a way that really nothing else had ever captivated me in my life. And it didn't really make sense because I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know what it meant. But I was drawn to it, and I was kind of literally drawn into it. I bought the book, and I looked at it, and then I kind of journeyed into it. And I had a deep desire to know what this was. And I bought the book, as I said, and I read about it, and Jung talked about it in the book. The book is by Carl Jung, who's a Swiss psychologist who did some very interesting work with the mandala. And so that's how I first met it. But it was like kind of like an obsession, I guess you could say. I wanted to find out what this was and where it came from. And so I eventually traveled to India, and I went to Dharamsala. Actually, I hitchhiked across northern India with a Japanese friend, and ended up in Dharamsala. Didn't end up there. That's where we were going. And so I approached a very high Lama there and requested to learn how to paint mandalas because I was a painter at the time. And so that was my introduction. I never did learn to paint mandalas because they told me it would take a year to learn how to draw one. And I was 19, and that seemed like a year seemed like an impossibly long time to do anything, pretty much. So I didn't do that, but I followed the thread of the Tibetan path and ended up, that was 1967, and I ended up being ordained as a Tibetan Buddhist nun in 1970. And the place that I lived after I was ordained was the Swayambhu Stupa. I didn't quite live on the stupa, but about as close as you could get. I could pretty much reach out my window and touch it. And I lived with that stupa. And a stupa is a 3-dimensional mandala. And so I began to understand this idea of a centering principle in our lives, in our minds, in our culture, in our whole situation. And the way I learned that was by watching people relate to this stupa. And so for anybody who doesn't know, a stupa has a dome, and then it has a base of different levels, and then it has a spire on top. And it is literally a three-dimensional mandala. So I showed you that mandala in the book. I'll show you another one. Here I happen to have this card. So this looks two-dimensional, right? But actually, it's three-dimensional. It's a structure. It's a three-dimensional structure, and the stupa represents that. So if we place our minds in that kind of structure, it is like it's kind of like taking a rushing river and creating waterways so that the water goes into a certain pattern. So our mind's like a rushing river, which I think we can all relate to. If we meditate, we begin to create different kinds of pathways in our mind, in our psyche. And so that's what visualization does. So most people are familiar with normal meditation, which is now quite mainstream, called mindfulness, where you're aware of your breath, or you're aware of walking, or of chopping vegetables, or any kind of activity. But in the mandala, you actually have a much more complex process that you are orienting your mind to. And in that process, you are placing yourself, your own heart, in the middle. And then around that, there are 4 quadrants. And so by doing that, you are shifting the mind out of its wild, rushing stream pattern, and you're slowing it down, and you're creating a structure of wholeness, which has been recognized since time immemorial in many cultures. Certainly the Tibetan culture is not unique, but the Tibetan culture really developed this mandala. And many of you may have seen or has come to your local library or in some other way seen the sand mandalas created by the Tibetan monks, where they spend days with little kind of tubes with colored sand in it, creating this dimension, essentially, of the enlightened world. And so how does this affect us? Well, I can tell you that I did live by that stupa. I began to know what it meant, but it didn't really come home to me until I started to do mandala practice. And also I was introduced to that, the meaning of the mandala and the 5 Buddha families in the mandala, by Trungpa Rinpoche. When I came back from India as a nun, and it was late 1972, and he was teaching on the 5 Buddha families and the mandala. And he was relating it to our normal lives and talking about these 5 families in a way that really made very practical sense to me. It wasn't sort of a Tibetan concept. It was something like, oh, I can find myself in this. So he talked about the 5 families, the 5 Buddha families, and how to place our psyche inside the mandala. And so I'm going to do a more elaborate experiential introduction to this tomorrow night, but I wanted to just tell you a little bit about what happened to me doing this. So it was in the 80s when I really began to work more intensely with the mandala, incorporating what I learned from Trungpa Rinpoche and also teaching about the mandala. And what happened to me was it was as though I began to know my own mind. And of course, I was thinking about that phrase from the Greek philosopher Plato, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I was thinking about that. I was hiking up here the other day and I was thinking, that's interesting. The unexamined life is not worth living. And does that mean we should be analyzing our life all the time? Or in some way conceptualizing about our lives, otherwise it's meaningless. But what I was thinking as I was walking was that what that really means is the inward turning of our minds. Usually our mind's going out and grasping at various things, but if we turn back and we actually look at the mind itself, that process awakens our true nature. And I think that's what he was talking about. So what happened to me when I began to do the mandala work and understand the 5 families, the transformation of the poisons into wisdom, and then placing my mind in the structure of the center with the east, the south, the west, and the north, and knowing the symbolic meaning of each of those directions and of the center, knowing that, and then holding my mind there for an hour at a time. And of course, it wanders, but then you bring it back. The effect of that for me was to bring my experience into a sense of settledness, a sense of wholeness, which is different than mindfulness, in the sense that mindfulness does bring you into the present out of conceptual mind and stop that rushing river. But to have a symbolic structure in which I was placing my mind and to know what that meant created a sense of, I guess you could say, my world as whole. And we don't live that way normally. We don't live with a feeling of our world as whole. We live with a feeling of our world as fragments that we are traveling through. When we live in the mandala, we live with a feeling of understanding our world. We have our family, we have our friends, we have our job, and so on. And when you transform that through the mandala, you begin to understand the luminosity, the luminous presence of all of that. So what if you thought about your friends and your family as luminous presences in your existence, and that you were in the center of this luminous presence, all of which had symbolic meaning and which was perfect and whole in itself, that there wasn't anywhere to go outside of that, that it was perfect, self-perfected in itself. That's a very different feeling. So let's take a minute and just try to feel that. I'm not going to explain the meaning of all the directions and so on, but imagine that you are in the center of your world and you're settled there. You have a seat there. And all of those around you are luminous presences within that world. And you can relax here, because everything is already perfect. You don't have to fix it. It's a circle. And it's whole. So it's a little hard to come out of that and talk about it. So that sense of wholeness and centeredness that we have in the mandala is healing. This is what Jung discovered, that it heals the psyche. His patients in mental hospitals and so on would begin to draw or dream mandalas when their psyches began to heal. And so since then, Western psychologists have worked with that and used the mandala as a healing tool with various kinds of trauma, children with trauma, adults with trauma, and so on, and have scientifically discovered the power of it. And so what I teach in my book, do you teach in a book? what I communicate in my book is what is this Tibetan mandala, and how does this relate to me as a Western person? How can I work with that to transform my emotions into wisdom? And this, it's very specific. The 5 families, the sound, the color, the luminosity of each of the 5 families, and how you enter that and transform your world. And so just to finish what I want to say tonight, I want to talk a little bit about what that did for me. So when I started the really intense mandala practice, personally, I was in the full throes of raising my kids. My 2 daughters were in their early teens, and my son was like around 8, something like that. And it was a very challenging time. I was divorced. I had just met the man who was to be my future husband for 22 years, but he wasn't yet. And my life was pretty chaotic, trying to be a single mother and raise 3 kids, and relate to my practice. And so I began to teach the mandala and to do intensive mandala practice. And what I found happened was that my world transformed, and what wasn't right in my world would move out, and what was right would move in. And sometimes it wasn't what my plan had in it. It would be, things that I thought were supposed to be there, and they'd be gone. But what happened was gradually this wholeness formed in my life that created the base out of which Tara Mandala was born. Tara Mandala. And so it was a personally transformative template, and it became this place, this amazing place that we have in Colorado, with a 3-story mandalic temple that's carved and painted by Tibetan and Bhutanese artists, and also became what I teach and have shared with many people. And so the book now is the first time that really I guess you could say, coming out of the closet or going public with these things that I've taught fairly privately for many years. And so I hope this gives you a bit of an idea of the mandala, at least a taste of it. It's been so formative in my life and really has governed my whole life since I was 16. And so I want to share it with the world. And our world now is very fragmented, right? It's like really it's hard to even describe. It's like all these fractals flying around. And the internet is wonderful, and we can do things like this, but it also, there's just so much traffic. I think that's the way, there's just so much traffic. And so the mandala creates a dome of quiet and transformation within all that traffic. And from that dome, that mansion, that four-doored house that you place your mind in, then you function into that fragmented world, and you can begin to bring that centered wholeness into your world, wherever that is. And so that's a little taste of what the mandala is. And tomorrow night I'm going to actually transmit this practice, do this practice with you of the mandala, and so that you can learn about it and experience it. And tomorrow's actually the book launch day, and so we're really excited here at Tara Mandala, and excited for you to find this book. And somehow I feel like this book is going to change the world, and I want you to be part of that and share it with you, and would love to hear from you about your experience when you get the book, and try to use it and see how it goes. So it's coming up tomorrow. Many of you have pre-ordered it, and that's wonderful. And interested to meet you along the way in my book tour. I'll be at Kripalu in Lenox, Massachusetts. First event, the 10th to 13th of May. And then in New York City at ABC Home, opening the big launch there on the 17th, and then go on to various other places, Boston, Nova Scotia, Key West, the West Coast, and so on. So, yeah, let's sit together for a minute and dedicate the merit of our time together tonight. And that means that we gather up all the energy that we generated together, and we send that out to benefit all beings everywhere. Just like we set the intention in the beginning, now we've done it, now we offer it out. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow. Lots of love. Good night.